Our deep dive into every single Contra game ever made continues, as we explore further into the franchise's wild and sometimes perplexing evolution. In this video, we'll cover everything in the series starting from its questionable 3D phase in the late 90s, all the way up to the recently released Operation Galuga, running and gunning through all of the sensational returns to glory and some dubious detours along the way. Let's review aggressively once again and check out every Contra game. Our journey begins today with Contra's first appearance in true three-dimensional space. Legacy of War was released in North America in 1996 on the PS1 and in Europe in 1997, and also received a North American port to the Sega Saturn in that same year. Rather than develop in-house like Konami had with their previous titles, they outsourced development to Appaloosa Interactive, a studio formerly known as Novotrade, who are probably most well known for the Echo the Dolphin series. This would also be their first game on the PlayStation, and the transition from the 2D masterpieces on 16-bit hardware resulted in a rather awkward misstep for the series overall, but still morbidly fascinating in many ways. The game's story is set up as a retelling of Contra Hardcore, but with a somewhat revised timeline. The main villain here is Colonel Bassad, who has stolen an alien cell with intent for world domination, of course, and it's up to the Hardcore to stop him. Ray from the Genesis game has been included, but the other three new characters are Tasha, CD288, and Bubba, all with their own weapon loadouts and some small differences in speed and jumping abilities. At its heart, Legacy of War is still definitely fitting into the usual run-and-gun framework, but transferred into a 3D isometric view with a dynamic and often frustrating camera that you're unable to control directly. Auto-fire is in effect for shooting, and you can acquire additional guns in a similar fashion to Contra Hardcore with a different set of weapons available depending on your character. The hidden item cache concept from Contra Force comes back into play here, as you may need to search for destructible walls to find power-ups, barriers, and much needed extra lives. You can also toggle into strafe mode and lock your position with trigger buttons. And of course jump, although sadly the classic somersault is missing in action here. I should also mention jumping is usually required to hit enemies at higher elevations, as you cannot aim upwards or downwards without the aid of a homing weapon. One-hit kills are sort of in play here, although there's actually not any sort of death animation when you get hit, making your life counter almost feel like a health bar. There are 3 difficulty modes, with easy mode letting you keep weapons after dying, and also cutting the game a bit short at a certain point and telling you to play like a man in order to see through all 7 stages and experience the true ending. Normal and hard modes decrease the life count and honestly provide one of the most challenging experiences in the entire series, especially if you refuse to save scum on the memory card, a feature that lets you save your progress and reload in case you don't want to waste a continue. While I do appreciate a good challenge, this game is often hard due to frustrating shortcomings of the design. The camera is really zoomed in and very erratic, and coupled with fast-moving enemy spawns that often appear very close to you and shoot you before you have much time to react. The controls are also a bit temperamental, with some inconsistencies in getting the strafe to toggle properly, and some very janky platforming moments with rough representations of depth perception. It's a shame that dual analog controls did not exist yet for the PS1 at that point in time, as surely this game would have greatly benefited from twin-stick shooting. But if you know me, I have quite a lot of patience for some jank, so despite all of these complaints, there are still a few interesting and commendable things going on in this rather ambitious game, and surely the developers had to have been under a lot of stress and pressure handling such an experimental moment in the franchise.
Your feeble skills are no match for me.
The action still moves along at a brisk pace, keeping things varied and interesting, with all sorts of bosses that you might recognize from previous games, and even vehicular moments like the rafting and motorboat sections. There's some silliness as well, like this jungle arcade with little mini arcade games that you can take a break with. So kind of the enemies to calmly wait outside for you to finish up a game of Pack Tank. On the presentation side, the game looks a bit messy with its combination of low poly models, muddy textures, and some sprite-based objects. But overall, it's pretty okay considering that era of 3D gaming. And if you're wanting a more migraine-inducing experience, early copies of the game included those good old red and blue 3D glasses for a pretty awful looking 3D mode. Music is solid, with some classic Contra themes returning and finding its way onto CD-based audio for the first time, although sometimes it feels weirdly out of sync with a general lack of music changes during boss fights. I should also mention the Saturn port at this point, which plays generally the same as the PS1 version and has the same content, but it does have some very slight graphical differences. I can't really recommend one version over the other here, so just pick whichever is more accessible to you if you want to check this out. I know I may be complaining a lot about this one, but honestly, at times I was genuinely having a bit of fun playing this, but mostly when on easy mode, or when dipping into the variety of cheat codes available. Even after being able to 1cc most of the previous entries of the series in my quest to beat every Contra game, clearing normal mode on this game ended up feeling unreachable for me without using the memory card features, and I shudder to think of even trying hard mode again. I'm not saying it's impossible, but at a point I knew I should cut my losses and move on. Overall though, it's ultimately a disappointment and a harsh drop in quality compared to the amazing Contra Hardcore which just came out a couple years prior. And despite their missteps on Legacy of War, Appaloosa would be tasked again with another Contra follow-up on the PS1 with C: The Contra Adventure, released exclusively in North America in 1998. And no, based on the title, it's not a point-and-click RPG Zelda-like thing, although it's notable that this ended up being a single-player only game. Continuing directly from the events of Legacy of War, the surviving alien antagonist crash lands in South America and takes over a Mayan temple. Our cyborg friend Tasha investigates the situation, but contact is lost, so now it's up to Ray to chew bubblegum and kick some alien ass. And you might be thinking we have a return to 2D glory upon loading up the first level, but the bait and switch feeling is strong here, as level 2 drops you right back into the wild and weird world of 3D, albeit this time with a typically free-form and adjustable camera, giving off some Tomb Raider-esque vibes, but still retaining a focus on fast-paced gunplay, supported by auto-aim functionality. Throughout the main 9 levels of the game, there are a few other views as well, including top-down, or some fixed camera sections with sketchy platforming, and also a kinda cool throwback to the old base level view from the original. So a variety of perspectives is of course nothing new to the series, but this might be the most varied and somewhat experimental collection we'd see so far, for better or worse. As far as other mechanics go, you do have a life bar instead of dying in one hit, and you can carry up to 3 different weapons and switch between them at will. Weirdly, picking up a 4th weapon is kind of a crapshoot, as it's a bit hard to realize which weapon you'll be replacing. The machine gun, laser, spread, and crusher missiles are still here, along with a grenade launcher and this weird shrapnel gun thing which just sprays metal chunk things all over the place. Smart bombs can also be collected as well. And the stages move along pretty briskly, with numerous mini-bosses and large-scale action set pieces breaking up the adventure pretty well.
Sit down, punk.
And despite the free-form 3D stages, you probably won't have to take a lot of time exploring the level, although you often have to blow up various switches to open up new areas, and sometimes they can be a little tricky to track down. You'll surely recognize a few remakes of previous bosses from older games, and plenty of new surprises as well. And one of the more unique new moments is this anti-gravity battle with a control scheme reminiscent of the Asteroids arcade game as you drift around a chamber in ball form while blasting away bad guys. Overall, this game feels a little more polished than Legacy of War, and the graphics are solid for the time period, the music's pretty good, voice samples are some knockoff Duke Nukem cringe, and it controls surprisingly okay considering the variety of gameplay modes. While this one has been generally reviewed a bit more harshly than Legacy of War was, I honestly had more fun getting through this one. The difficulty is a lot more balanced and reasonable as well. It does have a truncated easy mode again, along with normal and hard modes, and memory card functions like before, but it's generally not as punishing. Surprisingly, I also found the 2D stages to be some of the most bland moments of the game. It almost feels like they may have been shoehorned in just to appease some of the complaints from the previous game, and maybe to be able to use the screenshots to lure the old fans back to the series. I can't deny that both of these PS1 titles were still a pretty low point in the franchise overall, but I wouldn't disregard them entirely. If anything, they were ambitious and tried to go in some interesting directions, but the developers probably didn't exactly have the resources to properly execute on their ideas. It's a good example of how the Contra logo on the title screen certainly brings certain expectations of what the game should be, but in hindsight, maybe Appaloosa was dreaming of what it could be. Or maybe they were just getting paid. But either way, I'd still suggest checking these out with an open mind, maybe plop in a cheat code or two, and embrace the jank a little bit. Konami would take development duties back in-house with Contra's first appearance on the PlayStation 2 with Contra Shattered Soldier, released in 2002. Nobuya Nakazato would handle the game's direction after his work on Contra 3 and Contra Hardcore, disregarding the PS1 game's experimental 3D mechanics and story, and placing this in the timeline as a direct sequel to Contra Hardcore and restoring its two-dimensional roots with more modern-looking graphics. The plot gets pretty interesting with this one, where Bill Reiser has been blamed for massive losses of life after the Alien Wars, including being accused of the murder of Lance Bean, but is released from a cryogenic prison to handle the terrorist group Blood Falcon with the aid of Lucia, a playable and functionally identical cyborg soldier. Cutscenes throughout the gameplay uncover all sorts of intrigue and twists in the story, which even changes slightly depending on your gameplay performance, and leads to a variety of possible endings. As mentioned, the gameplay returns to the classic one-hit kill side-scroller style. There's a considerable focus on boss fights here, where any actual running and gunning is often broken up with wild assortments of encounters with massive machines or disgusting monsters, and even some fresh twists on familiar foes. A new weapon system would be introduced here, where Bill and Lucia can switch between 3 different weapons at any time with no need for collecting power-ups. Each of the guns, a machine gun, flamethrower, and grenade launcher, also has a unique charge-up shot attack, so you end up with a pretty decent array of tactics at your disposal to adapt to whatever situation is at hand, and you'll never be downgraded to a weaker weapon loadout if you die. A hit rate mechanic would also be added here, tracked and measured on screen as the percentage increases with the more enemies and objects you destroy, and it decreases as you lose lives or use continues. You get ranked at the end of each stage, and it's this score, along with your selected difficulty level, that can affect how far into the game you can get and ultimately see the true final ending. The game has 7 levels in total, with you being able to select from the first 4 and play through in any order, and training modes unlocked for stages as you complete them. You can also unlock options for increasing your lives and continues the more you play, arming you with enough resources to practice the game's patterns, and eventually rank high enough to access the rather abstract and sometimes psychedelic final levels of the game. The most hardcore soldiers out there might be able to pull off a perfect S rank on every stage and get to see a secret and absolutely ridiculous ending as well, so there's a lot of replayability in this one if you're looking for a true challenge. Thoughts on the overall presentation on this game have been a bit mixed. While the overall design and kinetic energy is very much the essence of Contra, with over-the-top action sequences and some absolutely wild boss fights, the aesthetic is usually a bit more dark and gritty than usual, with mostly drab and muted color schemes and 3D rendered objects instead of pixel art. It's certainly a product of its time in the early 2000s, but I think it might have benefited from a more colorful and vibrant take on the art style. Sound design is overall pretty great, albeit in a different direction than past games, but it does have a very energetic soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka and Sota Fujimori, blending thrash metal, break beats, and techno into a sonic frenzy that really adds to the vibe and hectic action of the game. Overall, it was great to see this entry in the series get back to the core of what makes Contra great, while also introducing some new ideas. And I'd argue this one went under the radar for a lot of people at the time, either from them disregarding the series after the PS1 mishaps, or perhaps also due to 2D action games not really being top sellers in the early 2000s. And I'd say if you had to pick one Contra game from the last 25 years to reevaluate today, it's gotta be this one. It's full of very memorable moments, and packed with satisfying challenges if you can push yourself to its conclusion. Contra would receive another game on the PS2 in 2004 with Neo Contra, developed in-house once again by Konami with their team Neo Kijirushi, albeit taking a different direction in gameplay for Contra's 10th game in the series. Bill would be pulled out of cryosleep once again to handle another menace to planet Earth, this time being woken up in the year 4444 to deal with a few renegade Neo Contra warriors. But once again, the plot unravels and twists in other unhinged ways, giving this installment one of the most bonkers storylines of the franchise that I don't even want to spoil, alongside with an overall jacked up level of absurdity in its characters and set pieces. While it does retain some elements from Shattered Soldier, like the lack of weapon pickups, hit rate mechanics, and level structures, the actual gameplay goes for a mostly isometric view, not that far removed from Legacy of War. Aside from the typical top-down shooter controls, one of your weapons can also home in on specific higher elevation targets, and you would also get dash and dodge maneuvers for avoiding hazards. There's also more variety in your weapons, as you can unlock more loadouts as you progress through the game, not to mention the other playable character Jaguar's katana-based attacks. The game also does throw in moments of different perspectives depending on the situation, for a decent variety of gameplay here. And while at the time Neo Contra was a bit criticized for detouring away from side-scrolling, the controls and camera work really well, and everything feels much better executed than its PS1 predecessors. The continuation of the hit rate ranking system returns, but feels a bit more lenient compared to Shattered Soldier, with reduced penalties for dying and only needing 98% for S rank. And in general, the difficulty seems more reasonable for anyone looking to get the true ending, especially once you unlock the weapon loadout with Heaven's Laser, an absolutely OP sub-weapon that honestly kinda breaks the game. But with 7 different loadouts available, some of the more esoteric guns can prove to add some extra challenge if you seek such a thing. The overall presentation fits pretty well into the series and feels a bit more lively and fun compared to Shattered Soldier, albeit arguably reaching peak levels of absurdity in the franchise. We'd be treated to fully voiced cutscenes in this one, giving some more character to this cast of ridiculous Contra warriors, like the Gorilla Contra, Plant Contra, Pheromone Contra, and Animal Contra.
Trap? Indeed! This ship is about to self-destruct. You will die. A moth drawn to my flame.
The soundtrack's great, the graphics are very well done, and everything feels tightly designed and very well fleshed out. Yet despite all of this, reception to this one has been pretty mixed since its release. Admittedly, I kind of discarded this game when it first came out, with disappointment for the switch to isometric gameplay, but honestly, replaying it again recently was an absolute blast. And maybe it doesn't have much competition, but for me it's easily the best 3D-centric Contra game of the series. In commemoration of the 20-year anniversary of the Contra franchise, 2007 saw the release of Contra 4 on the Nintendo DS. Konami would hire out another developer this time around, putting WayForward in charge of crafting this somewhat nostalgic homage, taking Contra back to its roots with an experience more akin to the 8 and 16-bit games, but on the dual-screen handheld. And it was the first new and original portable Contra game since Operation C on the Game Boy. The game's events take place 2 years after Contra 3 and the defeat of Red Falcon, but now Black Viper has returned, and it's up to Bill and Lance and Mad Dog and Scorpion to stop it. Yep, to further confuse the Contra timeline, they are all separate individuals now, and these 4 are selectable from the start, with a handful of other unlockable characters as well, including Sheena, Probotector, Lucia, or even Jimbo and Sully. All of them are functionally identical, but a nice throwback to the previous games. Gameplay mostly takes the form of 2D side-scrolling action, with the biggest differentiator from most of the classic games being the full use of both screens of the DS, giving this game a similar layout to the vertically oriented arcade games. To accommodate for this, you're given a grappling hook, which can fire directly upwards and pull you up to various ledges when needed. Otherwise, the controls are pretty standard, jumping, shooting, and you can lock your stance to aim, and switch between 2 different guns much like Contra 3. Similar to the arcade Super Contra, you can upgrade a gun by obtaining the same power-up once more. Your standard gun and a lot of the other guns do not have rapid fire, so for better or worse, there is a return to button mashing here. Weapon power-ups include the familiar machine gun, laser, spread shot, fireball, homing, and crusher missiles. Aside from the side-scrolling stages, we'd also see a return of the behind-the-back perspective of the original base stages, utilizing some neat 3D effects and putting a generally useless map onto the second screen. Again, this is a cool throwback, which is a recurring vibe through the game's 9 stages, as we get lots of references and fresh takes on locations like the waterfall or new evolutions of old bosses. Content-wise, there are multiple difficulty settings, and they would introduce a challenge mode, which lets you take on various short missions with unique requirements. There are also plenty of unlockable characters and other goodies, even including emulated versions of the NES Contra and Super C, which honestly don't perform so hot, but it's kinda neat anyway. Overall, it's pretty clear that WayForward put a lot of care into this one, and it really feels like a loving tribute to the golden age of Contra games, with a great soundtrack remixing a lot of the classic themes, and very vibrant and detailed pixel art. It's definitely a challenging game as well. Even the game's normal mode will put serious Contra players through their ringer, although there are moments when it's easy to blame the gap between the 2 screens for obscuring incoming bullets or enemies, and you'll have to train your eyes to keep more aware of the entire play area. Button mashing on the handheld DS can also get a bit tiresome, so really my main gripes with this game are mostly due to the hardware quirks. And I've always thought it would be cool to get a remade version of this game without the screen gap and on a more TV-friendly platform. Notably, there were several mobile versions of this game on various phone operating systems, even seeing a Contra 4 Redux being made with an all-new final boss, and in some cases the ability to play in horizontal or vertical mode depending on how you flip your phone screen.
What is this place?
Contra would also get the Rebirth treatment in 2009 with an installment in Konami's series of WiiWare exclusives, reimagining some of their classic franchises, which also included Castlevania and Gradius. Developed by M2, who had become well known for handling emulations of re-released retro games, this one also plays like a love letter to the 80s and 90s titles, focused on over-the-top 2D run-and-gun action. Plot-wise, it decides to go off on a completely alternate timeline, Set in the year 2633, at the same time the original Contra took place, but with the antagonist Neo Salamander organization attempting to travel back in time to 1973 to kill Contras of the past, Terminator style. And Bill Reiser would also be sent back in time to rescue Lance, who had gone missing on a mission to avert this. Other characters include Genbei Yagyu, aka Jaguar from Neo Contra, along with an unlockable android girl version of Brownie, and the lizard man, Newt Pliskin. Some characters do have some slight attribute differences in speed and jump height, giving some minor differences in gameplay tactics during your playthroughs. The weaponry in this one is a bit limited. Even though you can switch between two weapons here, the only available power-ups are the spread shot, laser, and homing missiles. The game is also a bit short, with 5 stages and a final boss stage, which isn't too surprising for a WiiWare downloadable only title, but the levels are at least chock full of action with an intensity not far off of the frantically paced 16-bit Contra games. And the absurdity is amplified here, with memorable moments like the robot camel train, or riding on top of hordes of hard-shelled alien critters, not to mention some bizarre dialogue during its still image cutscenes. Overall, it does have a bit of a budget game feel, with some kind of cartoony looking art and truncated feeling content, but it still plays very well, has a really great soundtrack, and should appeal to anyone looking for a classic Contra experience. Difficulty-wise, easy and normal modes are very reasonable to get through, and true masochists can try out the game's Nightmare mode, which still grants unlimited continues, but serves up Kaizo-like levels of challenge, making some sections feel more like an insane action puzzle experience to figure out how to survive the onslaught of enemies and bullets in your path. Unfortunately, there's no way to purchase this game anymore thanks to the closure of the Wii Shop channel in 2019, but we're all crossing our fingers someday for Konami's re-release of these unique Rebirth titles. And in what might be the most obscure game in our list today, 2009 also saw the release of Contra: The War of the Worlds, released in China for Java-based cell phones. I should mention this wouldn't be the first time Contra appeared in Java form, with numerous ports of the original games floating around on that platform, some official and some certainly not, and many of which have been completely lost to time. But in this case, we would get a new and actually original Contra game that was legally published by Konami. Now, the only version I could get running was a Russian translation, so I'm honestly not sure what's going on story-wise, but it does have 4 side-scrolling stages and the typical run-and-gun action you would expect, but just with a pretty rough frame rate and added life bar. Despite this, the game is actually half decent considering the circumstances, with some unique levels and enemies, and including a very interesting mechanic in the second stage where gravity is periodically altered. If you can get a Java emulator up and running and remap those phone keys to a gamepad, this one's definitely worth a look for a franchise completionist. The following year would see yet another Contra game hit mobile platforms with Contra Evolution, first releasing in China in 2010 and eventually becoming an arcade game in 2011, and finally ported worldwide to Android and iOS platforms in 2013. It's essentially a remake of the original NES Contra, but with a questionable facelift, replacing the pixel art with a low-rent asset store HD look. But otherwise, the gameplay is very similar, with some slight differences in challenge here and there, and a choice to play as Bill, Lance, or the newcomers Erica and Sally, who also have some different weapon pickups available. The arcade version seen here also includes a ranking system to grade your performance after each stage, but that's just more for bragging rights than anything else. The mobile versions would toss in a boss rush mode, elite mode with stronger enemies, and a mission mode mainly for grinding out medals to purchase unlockables, which of course could also be bought with real money via microtransactions. I spent more time with the arcade version than the mobile ones, since I'm not much of a fan of touchscreen controls for this kind of game, and while it's visually very cheap looking, it's pretty tough to mess up the gameplay of the original Contra, and that's basically intact here. throwing in at least a couple curveballs here and there to keep veteran players on their toes. I will say the mobile version of this game has been delisted for a while, presumably to make room for Konami's current mobile game offering, Contra Returns, released in China in 2017 and eventually seen a worldwide release in 2021. Developed by a subsidiary of Tencent Games, it warps the Contra formula into a free-to-play MMORPG monstrosity, loaded with microtransactions at every turn, shoehorned crossovers with other franchises like the Terminator, and long gacha grind collectibles and items. I don't have much more to say about this one, as it honestly hurts my 8-bit heart to see Contra in this kind of form. But arguably, it probably must be appealing to someone out there, considering the revenue it's likely bringing in. So maybe one might have some fun with it if they need a quick Contra fix on their cell phone.
The other side of Galuga.
Now let's get back to a good one now, with a Contra game without the name, Hardcore Uprising, released in 2011 for the Xbox 360 and PS3. Developed by Arc System Works, who at the time was most well known for creating the Guilty Gear fighting game series, their take on the Contra franchise would act as a prequel to Contra Hardcore, while taking things into a different artistic direction, going for an anime-infused aesthetic while also building a bit further upon the typical gameplay mechanics and systems. Story-wise, the game takes place in 2613, 20 years prior to the events of the first Contra, where an elite group of resistance fighters are rebelling against the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The main base characters include Bahamut, an indirect reference to Colonel Bahamut, and Crystal, a faster female character. Other playable characters are available through individual DLC purchases, each with their own differences in story progression, health, speed, and weaponry, with the most notable outlier being the very powerful Sayuri, with a focus on sword melee combat that completely changes up the gameplay approach. While it is a bit annoying to have to purchase the extra content here, I'd say the extra characters are worth it in this case, as they add a really nice amount of replayability, as you have to approach situations much differently depending on who you're playing as. Gameplay options consist of two different modes, Arcade Mode and Rising Mode, with Arcade Mode being a more traditional experience of progressing through the game's 8 levels, starting out with a limited number of continues, but gradually unlocking more with more gameplay time. Rising Mode plays differently, in that currency acquired in levels will let you purchase various upgrades and essentially level up your character in a wide variety of ways, from new maneuvers, more health, more lives, and plenty more. It feels like a bit more of an RPG-light grind at times, but it does make the game more approachable, and it's a great way to improve your skills before potential attempts at the more unforgiving arcade mode. Now getting into the actual gameplay, Hardcore Uprising follows in the footsteps of Contra Hardcore by sticking to pure 2D side-scrolling. Most characters have health bars, also akin to the Japanese version of Contra Hardcore, but weapon storage would use the tried and true Contra 3 approach, with 2 weapon slots that can be changed at will, and various weapon pickup capsules that will appear throughout the stages, and with upgrades available if you can grab the same power-up again. Weapons include the standard rifle, a machine gun, chain laser, grenade launcher, heat gun with a chargeable fireball, the spread shot, and a unique ripple gun, which offers up some defensive tactics. Another very big change to the controls here would be in your movement, with the ability to run much faster after double tapping a direction, a double jump, a parry counter, and a mid-air dash, with all these skills making this easily one of the more complex movesets so far in the series. It takes a while to rein in all these abilities and use them effectively, but it does make the game feel really agile and dynamic once you get a handle on it. Getting into the levels, there's quite a lot of variety and scenery in the game's 8 stages, each also feeling pretty lengthy with plenty of mid-bosses and various action set pieces to keep things moving along, and it supplies a healthy amount of content considering it was a download-exclusive Contra game, and especially so if you were to put this side by side with the 5 short stages of Contra Rebirth. I guess one downside here is that finishing a full run of this game can be a bit grueling, as the last few stages ramp up the difficulty rather drastically, especially considering having what I consider to be the most difficult final boss sequence of the entire series. Other than that, my only other minor complaints are some pretty rough sound effects, with some kinda nasty sounding distorted yelling and bad audio balancing on the Xbox 360 version. And it's also a little bit disappointing to be typically battling against humans and giant robots as opposed to gross aliens and stuff. There are a couple monstrous moments here and there, and really that's just a personal preference that doesn't affect how great of a running gun that this remains to be. The mechanics and level designs are all very well crafted and thoughtful, with plenty of that over-the-top Contra action we come to expect. And the level of challenge is hugely customizable depending on your taste, and if you don't mind the new anime look to everything, it's a really great looking game, despite being a departure from the usual. Overall, I'd highly recommend giving this one a go for a fresh take on the series, but just be ready for some suffering once you finally face off with Tiberius. And now for one of the more controversial directions the series has gone in, it's time to discuss the maligned and critically reviled Contra Rogue Core, released in 2019 for PC and other modern console platforms, and being the first new Contra game with a physical release since Contra 4. Nobuya Nakazato would return after his work on the masterpieces Contra 3, Contra Hardcore, and Shattered Soldier to oversee development on this one, claiming a desire to capture the traditional spirit of the Contra series while modernizing it for a new audience. To me, this sounds more like a meaningless blurb churned out by a marketing team, but let's dig more into this one and give it a fair shot here, as I actually gave this game a pretty thorough playthrough recently, despite a lot of initial disappointment when the first game released. Rogue Core takes place 2 years after the end of the Alien Wars in a post-apocalyptic cityscape called the Damned City, overrun with fiends, and it's up to this ragtag group of super soldier Jaegers to deal with them, including Kaiser, a cracked-out Bill Riser-like with a drill for an arm, Miss Harakiri, a sword-wielding assassin with an alien for a stomach, the Gentleman, a well-mannered and intelligent alien bug thing, and Hungry Beast, a cyborg panda.
Hungry Beast! I love him so much.
From the cast of characters alone, the overall tone is a weird mix of goofy and edgy, and you do get a little bit more atmosphere and lore from some occasional comic book art style still image cutscenes, which feel a little cheap, but it at least gives a little more substance. The core gameplay concept is where things get real divisive. It's mostly an isometric twin-stick shooter, not far removed from Neo Contra, with some brief perspective switches to top-down or a behind-the-back shooting gallery kind of view. You've got a main weapon and a sub-weapon, both with unlimited ammo, but each gun also has a heat meter that must be managed. Once a gun overheats, there is a cooldown period where you must either wait or switch to your other weapon. A mechanic completely new to the franchise and noticeably drags down the pacing of combat right from the start. For better or worse, putting a stronger focus on resourceful tactics, movement, crowd control, and damage optimization. Each character also has a special ability on a cooldown, occasional time duration classic-style power-ups such as the spread shot, and there are also collectible bombs which you can use to drop massive damage onto the screen. Rogue Core would also introduce RPG looter-shooter elements, as you level up your characters and gather all sorts of currency, resources, item schematics, and even body parts, which you can then use to augment your stats and weapon loadouts back at home base. Now, this is a genre I can certainly get into, as I've logged more hours in games like Diablo and Borderlands than I care to admit, but again, it's kind of a surprising turn for the Contra franchise that really wasn't received well, and again makes the game start at a somewhat glacial pace as you soon realize the grind that you're in for in a lengthy campaign ahead. The gameplay is split up into a long list of missions which can be selected, which include about 40 missions divided into 7 difficulty ranks, each with a big boss fight at the end, along with a handful of longer exploration missions and some more challenging hardcore missions. This might seem like no shortage of content, especially since the missions can be pretty long, but many of the locations, enemy types, and mini-bosses are heavily recycled and reused often. Now, at least in my experience, I did not have to repeat very many missions as far as grinding out experience and items goes, unless I happen to have died on a difficult boss or something. But the repetition of very similar levels and battles makes it feel like a bit of a slog. And if you aim for higher ranks for each mission, obviously it gets more so, but going for that is optional. Now, there is a very wide array of weapon types you can collect and optimize with various modifications, along with some weird gambling mechanics added onto the body part customization by paying more in-game currency for the potential of a better eyeball or heart installation. But the general progression feels a bit unsatisfying and often confusing. Your characters never really change appearance based on your gear, and you can't even really look at the gear at all. It's all just simple icons and poorly explained attributes. And while I do love seeing numbers go up in this kind of game, it's just not usually very exciting here. But I should at least give this game a bit of credit for a vast selection of weird weapons to collect and build upon, ranging from the classic machine guns and lasers to more bizarre choices like razor hula hoops and rocket fists. Gameplay aside, the presentation feels dated for a game released in 2019 by an established publisher. Obviously, I don't mind the retro aesthetic, but the look and style here feels almost like a muddy-looking PS2 game. Not to mention there are rather noticeable performance issues on the two versions I played. Rogue Core also supports a range of multiplayer options, with online co-op and PvP modes, which is honestly a side of the game I did not experience yet, and with the right group, I have to assume this could be more fun. But good luck finding anyone willing to play this one with you, when there are certainly better examples of the genre out there currently. And on the DLC tip, there surprisingly wasn't a huge focus on selling you microtransactions, compared to the previously mentioned Contra mobile games. But there is a Season Pass, which gives you a bit of in-game cash, items, and character skins. And it might be worth the extra couple of bucks if you can get the pass along with the game whenever both of them go on frequent deep discounts on Steam or wherever else. The extra currency really helps the initial grind be more tolerable. Now overall, the experience here is weird. I think I already stated most of my gripes, but the game does redeem itself at times, with some true moments of actual good old Contra radness hiding in there, especially in a few of the bigger boss battles. I especially like the multiple run-ins with Big Fuzz and this pretty insane subway fight. It's just kind of a bummer that these moments are sandwiched between hours of rehashed missions and areas. And if you're not up for a little loot grind, you may want to steer very clear of this one. I'm reminded a bit of Contra Force on the NES in some ways, where there's some cool ideas, but they're buried deeply underneath various gameplay issues, poor performance, and the high expectations that I have for a game bearing the Contra logo. I will say after actually sinking some considerable time into this one, about 20 hours to get through the 7 ranks of standard missions and a pretty wild final boss, I certainly don't think it deserved a lot of the worst game of the year claims thrown out at the time of its release, and I'm surprisingly glad to have reevaluated it more deeply now, with an open mind and broader perspective on the varied directions the Contra series has taken as a whole. Basically, it's not for everyone, but it's not the hot garbage I thought it was after my first plays.
Time to introduce ourselves.
Hell yeah, brother.
And finally, we come to the most recent game in the franchise, released in the spring of 2024 on PC and modern consoles. It's Contra Operation Galuga, developed by WayForward, who were brought back after their work on Contra 4, and they even retained some of the same dev team. Rather than going for a fresh new canonical entry or trying more questionable genre experimentation, Operation Galuga is more of a remake or reimagining of the original Contra, taking place in the year 26XX in the same location as the first game, the Galuga Archipelago, with good old Bill and Lance versus the Red Falcon, and with good old 2D side-scrolling action. But obviously with all sorts of other familiar characters, enemies, and game mechanics popping up from other games in the series, along with introducing some new elements as well. In what is probably the most notable change in play controls is free aiming, by using the analog stick to shoot in any direction, although there is still an option to go back to 8-way shooting in case you want a bit of throwback and added challenge. Weapons are grabbed via power-ups with 2 slots to switch from at any time, and also upgradable with consecutive pickups. And the arsenal includes returns of the machine gun, spread shot, laser, homing, crusher missiles, and flame weapon. Different playable characters that you can unlock throughout the course of the game also have slight variations on each of these loadouts. Mobility also includes some variety between characters, with some folks having double jumps, air dashes, slides, grappling hooks, or even jetpacks. Game modes include a story mode, which supports up to 2 players, and includes some basic cutscenes and dialogue during the experience, and a more streamlined arcade mode, which supports up to 4 players simultaneously, and a challenge mode similar to what we got in Contra 4, with all sorts of short 1 to 2 minute mini missions with various completion requirements. There are also plenty of difficulty options with easy, normal, and hard modes for each, along with turning the health bar on or off in case you want the classic one-hit kill experience. Playing through any of the modes will also very slowly accumulate in-game currency, which can be used in the perk shop, where you can unlock more additional characters like our friends from Contra Hardcore like Brownie, Sheena, Brad Fang, or additional perks for each character, or general ones like extra lives and health, or alternate soundtracks like mixes of old Konami classics or modern remixes of recognizable Contra tunes. It remains to be seen if more things will be added to this shop over time or not, but I will say again, it takes a while to buy all of this stuff. Even after several hours and multiple playthroughs leading up to an arcade mode 1cc, I've personally only unlocked a few characters and soundtracks, and have a long way to go to get everything else. Getting into the meat of the game here, there are 8 levels total, all with some recognizable throwbacks to Contra locations, enemies, and bosses from previous games, and fans of the series might appreciate all the references strewn about here. You got jungles, bases, waterfalls, ruins, labs, and of course an alien lair, and plenty of old favorite bosses making comebacks here and there with new twists in their behavior. That being said, the stages are also pretty lengthy, but sometimes feel a bit padded and drag on a bit, especially in some of the auto-scrolling stages. You'd think riding a jet bike would be exciting as hell, but the base and train stages here get rather tedious. And I found a feeling of emptiness in the game's overall aesthetic as well. While there isn't anything really egregious here, it just comes off as aggressively bland and very safe, with a rendered look closer to the recent Contra mobile games as opposed to classic pixel art, which WayForward nailed so well in Contra 4, and a very generic default orchestral soundtrack reinforces this stale feeling, with nothing very memorable there, and I found myself quickly scrambling to purchase classic soundtracks from the perk shop. But even those really great chiptunes don't gel very well with the game in most cases. I guess the whole vibe of Galuga came off to me as seemingly attempting to reach a newer audience who may be fresh to the genre or series, while also trying to cater to the old Contra heads with a return to old mechanics and throwbacks. And not that there's anything wrong with trying to make a game more accessible, but here it feels pretty undercooked. It sits squarely in B-rank territory, almost feeling like concessions and compromises were being made with release date and revenue in mind, instead of more polish and just making the game more fun. To be fair, these thoughts are coming from myself fresh off of 2 months of playing through every game in the series, so naturally Galuga was under a pretty strict microscope, coupled with a mild bit of burnout after having just spent 20 hours on Rogue Core. So take my words with a little grain of salt. A fresher perspective or less experience with the series might make this one more enjoyable, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from giving it a shot sometime, especially if they drop the price a bit, with the $40 initial price tag feeling a bit on the high end, especially considering the numerous hours that you'll need to sink into this if you want to unlock all of the perk shop content.
Miss me, baby?
It also remains to be seen if Konami and WayForward will continue working on the game beyond any basic bug fixes. Perhaps down the road some additional content or balancing could see some improvements coming overall. Branching out of the series briefly here, recent years have seen a handful of indie games heavily inspired by Contra, some of which nail that classic vibe and gameplay even better than Konami's recent efforts. There are quite a few floating around out there, which may be a topic worth exploring deeper in another video someday, but here's a quick list to get you started. Super Cyborg is a 2015 title with a game feel very similar to the 8-bit days, but with some great unhinged boss designs and absolutely brutal difficulty. And more recently, we have Huntdown, a 2020 run-and-gun gem with some great B-movie flavored vibes. And also definitely check out Valfaris with a gory sci-fi heavy metal atmosphere. And Blazing Chrome from 2019 is probably one of the more blatantly obvious Contra-inspired titles of late, but they really nailed the aesthetic and style of the 16-bit games. And I'd say it's a must-play for fans of the earlier entries in the Contra series. And we surely shouldn't forget Cuphead, obviously with a much different art style and setting, but undoubtedly having that Contra mentality in its core gameplay and notorious difficulty. And while Operation Galuga might be the most recent mainline Contra game at the time of making this video, one thing I did not have on my bingo card this year was official Contra downloadable content being added onto Vampire Survivors, an indie roguelike game that first released in obscurity at the end of 2021, but eventually went viral and found great success in sales and award achievements. The developer has continuously supported and improved the game with engine optimizations and more content, which now includes this Contra DLC in collaboration with Konami, Operation Guns, which released on May 9th, 2024, and adds all sorts of new Contra-themed stages, characters, background music, some familiar bosses, and of course devastating weaponry. Now, unless we're gonna count some of the old top-down stages in games like Super C, the gameplay here isn't really going to scratch that pure Contra itch, but regardless, if you already like this game or others in the same style, you might have some fun mowing down hordes of enemies with all the eye-melting guns that you can upgrade. And of course, you can't go wrong with throwing in some classic Contra tunes in the background, direct from titles like Contra 4 or Contra Hardcore. And much like the base game, the DLC is very reasonably priced, and there are easily several hours to be spent here if you're trying to unlock everything. Also, this wouldn't be the first time Konami has had one of their franchises cross over with indie games, with Castlevania popping up in Dead Cells and V Rising, so I have to wonder if Contra will also start making appearances elsewhere. And one final recent Contra-related release to mention is on the unofficial tip, a fan-made port of the original Famicom Contra to the Super Nintendo by a developer that goes by the name Infidelity, who has also converted a few other NES titles to the Super Nintendo, often with the goal of eliminating slowdown and sprite flicker thanks to the more powerful hardware. Contra would get this treatment along with the addition of weapon switching a la Contra 3, along with the ability to strafe and lock your stance while shooting, which can certainly change up potential strategies for clearing the game. Also notably, the conversion includes MSU1 capabilities, offering up alternate soundtracks with choices between the original Famicom and arcade game music, metal and electronic covers of Contra themes, or even a cinematic soundtrack with orchestral scores ripped straight out of relevant action movies, and a new opening cutscene which surely will look familiar as well.
You son of a bitch.
While I probably prefer the OG authentic experience, and I've never considered the Famicom port to be struggling in terms of performance, this is still a very cool technical achievement and fun novelty, and the added control options or simply the convenience of playing this on your Super Nintendo might appeal to some players. And that wraps up our retrospective here, and I gotta say it's been a true pleasure exploring one of my favorite game franchises so deeply over the last few months. And it was a great experience being able to reevaluate some titles I'd never beaten before or just previously disregarded in the past, and gain a better perspective for all the twists and turns the series has taken. If you're curious, I've posted some of the full live playthroughs and 1cc runs on a second channel linked in the description, or also check out another video on the way where I personally rank every Contra game and port that we checked out. And make sure to take a look at part 1 of this every Contra game series if you haven't already, and if you have watched both of them, Consider yourself a hero. We'll see you in the next mission.